Mr. Hilsenrath, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you today.
Our economy is facing some big challenges now, like inflation and the debt ceiling. But instead of talking about those issues directly, I want to speak with you about Janet Yellen, who is our Secretary of Treasury, who obviously is very important to our economy and has been important for our economy for many years now. And lucky for me and our audience, you've recently written a book about her. It's sitting right next to me here on the shelf, and it's titled Yellen, the Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. Mm-hmm. So let's get into it. In the book, you write about Yellen's preparation. In fact, there's some language about compulsive preparation. Yeah, tell us about this.
Well, so Janet Yellen grew up in Brooklyn, and she had a difficult mother. Her mother was very demanding, retired school teacher, who pushed Janet and her older brother, Jon, not only to have their schoolwork done every night, but to have it done properly. They were not allowed to
properly.
Right. They were not, especially their English. They were not allowed to turn in school assignments with mistakes. And she made sure of that the night before while they were doing their homework. Janet Yellen was also a woman who chose to become an economist in the 1960s at a time when very few women were entering that field. She became an economics professor at a time when very few women were teaching in that field.
Yeah.
And it became really ingrained in her personality that she had to have her work done, not only to prove herself to her mother, but also to prove herself to the other students in the class and to her professors and then to her colleagues. She, became really, as I say, compulsive about being sure that she was always the best prepared person.
I think you even have a passage about how other graduate students then, or maybe well into the future, were using her notes in graduate school.
Well, so she developed the relationship of a mentee with Jim Tobin, the professor at Yale, Nobel Prize winner. He took her under his wing, and she became the graduate assistant in his class who was responsible for taking notes of his lectures and then sharing those notes with other students. And her notes were so meticulous, were so carefully prepared. They became known as the Yellen notes, and they became really the roadmap for students, not only in her year, but for years succeeding. Literally, there are still people today who saved these notes as a map into Jim Tobin's brain. And if you look at the notes, it's not just the meticulousness with which she described the economic concept, but there are drawings in there that look like architectural renderings of.
I've seen illustrations in your book. Yeah.
And even the headers of the pages of these notes were meticulously prepared, because remember, this is in the days but before anything was digitized. So she had headers that stated the date, the page number, the lesson on every page. So if someone was to walk down the hall and drop all the notes, they could be reorganized in order in which they were prepared.
That's amazing. I'll make sure I'll never show my notes to Secretary Yellen. Let's flip this to the other side of this, sort of the characteristic of being prepared. Does that slow her down in the fast-paced world of being the Secretary of Treasury? Does that slow down her decision?
That's a great question. And I think it's been a knock on her in the past, that when we are in these crisis moments, she has a tendency to say, well, wait a second, what about this and what about that? And I'll give you an example. When the United States in 2022 was preparing sanctions packages against Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, the kind of nuclear missile in the armament was freezing Russian reserves held by the Federal Reserve, freezing the central bank, the Russia central bank assets. And there was a desire among the Europeans to move very quickly after the invasion because they were shocked that Putin had carried through with the invasion. And there was a decision on a weekend for a quick push that the White House wanted to do. And Yellen said, well, wait a second, we need to consider the long run implications of this. This could affect the standing of the dollar in the global marketplace, which is our source of economic advantage.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we have to think very carefully before we start freezing central bank assets. So she did tap the brakes in that case. It's laid out in the book on a Saturday of very intense negotiations. At one point, Mario Draghi, the prime minister of Italy, calls her up and says, we have to do this. And they went ahead and did it. I think what Yellen has learned from experience is that, sometimes events are moving fast and you've got to move fast too. And so I think she's grown and matured in
this
that
role
respect as a leader in recognizing that sometimes the decision point is here and you have to act. The last thing I'll say is that, being a Treasury Secretary is a much different job than being a Federal Reserve Chair. The processes at the Fed are very regimented. And there's an order in which things are typically done that I think was her comfort zone. There's crisis management where you have to do some fast moving, as we saw in COVID. But, her temperament is more to take things really methodically, but she's come to see in life that you can't always do that.
So do you think as the Secretary of Treasury, she is comfortable now, or is she compelled in the things she does?
She's both. I would say she's both. I'll tell you, when I've had chances to speak with her during her time as Treasury Secretary, I've been struck by how relaxed and comfortable she seemed in her own skin.
Nice.
In her early days as after the financial crisis as vice chair of the Fed, I think a lot of people inside the Fed had a sense that she sometimes had her hair on fire. She felt such a sense of urgency for the Fed to act to address high unemployment.
Yeah.
And I think when people see her now, they say, all right, she's she seems comfortable in her skin, and I think has learned a bit to laugh at herself for her mistakes. But you use the word compelled, and that certainly is what drove her into the job. She didn't want to do the job. When the Biden's emissaries first reached out to her in 2020 after the election, she said no, she wasn't interested. She was enjoying her retirement. And they came back a second time, actually reaching out to her brother as a middleman and said, we really want you. The economy is a mess. We need someone with stature and gravitas. Please consider this. And she stood in her kitchen with her son, Robbie, and her husband, George. And we really should talk about the two of them, because this book is really a love story involving that family as much as it is about a biography and an economic story. And they decided she had a duty. If the president asks you to serve, especially in a time of national crisis, she has a responsibility. And so, yes, she felt compelled to take the job. And I'll come full circle. She was a straight A student. She got A's in every class she ever took except German in college at Brown.
Okay.
Which also comes up in the book. But she certainly sees the inflation that we're experiencing today as a black mark on her record. And I think that she feels compelled to see that get under control before she decides it's time to walk off into the sunset and resume her retirement.
We'll be back after a short break to talk more about Janet Yellen.